A single father with a young daughter, he has lost everything: his wife, his house, his stable job. His last chance to stay afloat is a random ad in a small town. A handyman is needed to repair an old barn. When he arrives, he meets a silent middle-aged woman named Elizabeth Shepherd, who has been running the farm alone since her husband died. Everything looks simple, a job for a few weeks. But it turns out that this modest woman is one of the richest farmers in the state. Jacob Hunt's life had become a series of quiet, relentless losses. At 37, he was a solitary father, struggling to care for his small daughter, Lily, in a world that had seemingly turned its back on him. Once married to a loving woman and anchored by a stable job and a modest home, Jacob's life had unraveled in a matter of months. One by one, his foundations crumbled. The sudden death of his wife in an accident, the subsequent collapse of his business that left him bankrupt, and finally, the eviction that forced him to trade the comforting shelter of a house for the cold, relentless reality of life on the road. For months, he and Lily had taken refuge in their aging car, driving through town after town with heavy hearts and uncertain dreams. Every night, as Lily's soft breathing filled the cramped space of their makeshift home, Jacob promised himself that he would find a way to rebuild what was lost. One humid afternoon, while sitting in a sparse roadside diner trying to warm up with a cup of weak coffee, Jacob noticed a small, faded flyer pinned to the community bulletin board. The text, scrawled in neat handwriting, read, "Need a master handiworker to repair old barn. Contact E. Shepherd. Small town. Immediate work available." It was the kind of advertisement that didn't promise riches but offered the smallest chance of a new beginning. A chance to earn enough cash to buy food, pay bills, and perhaps, in time, regain a semblance of stability. Jacob's heart stirred with a cautious hope as he scanned the words. Although his pride ached at the thought of taking a job that only paid enough to keep him afloat, the desperate need to provide for Lily overrode every hesitation. That evening, with dusk settling over the small town as gently as a whispered promise, Jacob dialed the number attached to the flyer. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, a woman who introduced herself simply as Elizabeth Shepherd. She explained that she needed someone to repair an old, dilapidated barn on her property. The work was expected to last a few weeks, and while the pay wasn't lavish, it was steady, a lifeline Jacob desperately needed. Arrangements were made quickly. The next morning, with his couple of tools neatly organized in an old toolbox and Lily safely tucked into a corner of the car, Jacob set off on the short drive to the address provided. He entered a small town that wore its history on its weathered sidewalks and modest storefronts. Soon, he found himself driving down a narrow, winding road that led to an expansive property at the edge of town. There, nestled among fields and gentle slopes, stood an old barn. The barn looked as if it had weathered decades of storms and hardships, its wood marked by the passage of time, its roof sagging from years of neglect. A large farmhouse, modest but dignified, stood a few yards away, surrounded by well-tended gardens and a scattering of vehicles that glinted in the morning light. It was in front of that farmhouse that Jacob first met Elizabeth Shepherd. She was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-threaded hair pulled back into a neat bun and eyes that seemed to hold secrets of both sorrow and resolve. Her face was calm and unreadable, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself. Elizabeth greeted him politely, with a measured nod and a quiet "Hello, Mr. Hunt." Though she did not mention her full name at first, her tone was soft, almost reserved, and though she spoke little, her presence filled the space between them with a sense of mystery. As Jacob set down his tools and began the initial inspection of the barn, he noted how simply the world here appeared. The barn, though in need of urgent repair, was an unadorned structure built for function, a relic of past labor rather than a symbol of wealth. The farmhouse, too, seemed unassuming on first glance, with its peeling paint and modest architecture. Elizabeth's spoken instructions were minimal, and she allowed him to work independently, rarely offering guidance or commentary. It was as if she was a figure enveloped in a protective silence, managing the property on her own ever since the passing of her husband. The few interactions they had were courteous yet distant, a brief exchange here, a nod there, leaving Jacob with the impression that his employer was simply a practical, no-nonsense caretaker of an old homestead. Yet as the day progressed, subtle details began to hint that all was not as it seemed. While repairing part of the barn's roof, Jacob couldn't help but notice a few curious objects tucked away in a corner. There were well-maintained tools stamped with familiar logos, the insignia of large agricultural conglomerates that Jacob recognized from news articles. Near the back of the barn, behind a row of old wooden crates, a shiny, expensive pickup truck was parked, gleaming incongruously under the soft morning light. Inside the modest but meticulously organized office in the farmhouse, Jacob caught glimpses of documents and ledgers boasting figures that seemed astronomically high, figures that spoke not of simple rural accounting, but of deals and sums that he had never encountered in his everyday life. The juxtaposition was striking. Here was a place that appeared humble, run by a quiet, reserved woman who dressed in practical clothing and spoke in measured tones. Yet the hints of wealth, modern equipment, expensive vehicles, and financial documents suggested a secret life far beyond the surface of a faded country farm. Jacob's mind raced as he continued his repairs, his brown eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. Was it possible that Elizabeth Shepherd was not the impoverished widow he had initially assumed her to be, but rather a guardian of a hidden fortune? He noticed that while she managed the daily chores and maintained the property with seemingly modest means, every so often her gaze would linger on one of those expensive machines or a sealed envelope of papers, before quickly turning away as if the sight of wealth was both a comfort and a painful reminder of something lost. For the moment, Jacob kept these thoughts to himself while focusing on the task at hand. The rhythmic sound of hammering and the occasional creak of the old barn filled the morning as he climbed the ladder and worked on mending beams and replacing broken shingles. Across the field, Elizabeth stood on the porch of her farmhouse, watching him with an expression that was hard to decipher. A blend of quiet sorrow and guarded resolve. Her silence compelled Jacob to wonder about her story. There was a gravity in her eyes that hinted at a past filled with loss and resilience, a story that perhaps was as complicated as the secret numbers and logos hidden among her belongings. By the time the sun began its lazy descent toward the horizon, Jacob had made significant progress on the barn's repairs. His mind buzzed with questions. Who truly was Elizabeth Shepherd? What was the origin of the strange signs of affluence peppered around the property? And most haunting of all, why did her guarded eyes seem to hide a grief he couldn't yet comprehend? One thing was clear, however: this job, which had originally seemed like nothing more than a temporary lifeline to keep him and Lily afloat, was unfolding into something that could irrevocably change both his outlook and his future. Walking back to the farmhouse as dusk settled, Jacob's thoughts churned alongside the cool evening breeze. In that quiet moment, he resolved that whatever secrets Elizabeth held, he would learn them in time. For now, he would complete his work and absorb the mysteries around him. Little did he know, the very next day would bring revelations that would tie his fate to Elizabeth's in ways he could never have imagined. A past, a loss, and a hope for a future reborn together. Jacob spent the first day on the property surveying the old barn and the farmhouse that lay just a short distance away. Once his initial inspection was complete and he had gathered his basic tools, he returned to the cramped, modest workspace in the barn's shadow. The structure itself was a patchwork of time-worn wooden planks, its faded red paint peeling in long streaks down its sides. Although the barn appeared abandoned by design, its construction told a story of hard-working hands and a past when it had served as the hub of daily rural life. Now, though, it stood in disrepair, a symbol of forgotten labor and hidden resilience. The next morning, before dawn had properly broken, Jacob rose in the stillness of his small motel room and gently woke Lily. They drove in silence along a dusty lane, the gentle hum of the engine and the soft murmur of sleepy birds serving as an unintentional welcome. As they neared the farmhouse, Jacob's eyes widened a little at the unexpected blend of old-fashioned simplicity with subtle hints of elegance. The farmhouse, built with a mix of practical brickwork and wood, seemed modest on the surface, yet it was impeccably maintained. Flowers neatly arranged in window boxes, a freshly painted door, and an almost imperceptible glimmer from a low-hanging converted barn door hinted that someone with a discerning eye cared for this place. It was during this serene morning that Jacob first observed Elizabeth Shepherd in a more personal light. He had been called in to begin minor repairs on the barn roof, and after a few hours of steady work, climbing rickety ladders, pulling up split boards, and carefully nailing fresh timber into place, he looked up to see her standing at the edge of the property. Elizabeth was watching him from a distance, framed by a grove of mature trees that offered both shadow and serenity. Dressed in a simple, practical dress with muted hues, her posture was reserved but graceful. There was an air of quiet fortitude about her, a woman who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical and had chosen to maintain her dignity in silent resolve. The first encounter between them was wordless, marked by a respectful nod exchanged across the distance. Later, when Jacob returned to the farmhouse to collect a set of tools he had forgotten in the barn, he found Elizabeth waiting by the door. Her face, partly illuminated by the soft morning light, revealed delicate lines etched in sorrow and endurance. "Good morning," she said in a low, measured tone. Her voice was soft, yet there was a firmness to it that suggested she was a woman who spoke just enough and kept most of her truths close to her chest. "I hope the work goes well today." Jacob returned her greeting with a smile that betrayed both his own weariness and a newfound spark of hope. "I'll do my best," he replied, extending his hand for a brief, polite shake that cemented their first proper conversation. Though the interaction was brief, something in Elizabeth's guarded eyes hinted at stories she wasn't ready to share, and perhaps a silent invitation for trust. As the days passed, Jacob settled into a routine that was at once monotonous and surprisingly comforting. Each morning he ascended the creaky ladder to inspect the damage on the barn's roof. Each day he hammered and patched with a careful diligence that seemed to restore not just the wood, but the tired echoes of a once vibrant place. In between his strenuous work, he would catch glimpses of Elizabeth around the property. Sometimes she was tending the vegetable garden near the farmhouse. Other times she was seated on the old porch, watching the horizon with a gaze that suggested both longing and resignation. It wasn't long before an unspoken warmth began to grow between the two of them. Elizabeth, once silent and enigmatic, would occasionally offer small gestures, a cup of strongly brewed tea placed on a battered wooden table at midday, or a gentle compliment about his steady work. While Jacob appreciated the kindness, he remained curious about the woman who managed everything on this land with such a quiet strength. Her routine was as rhythmic and steady as the farm itself. Early rises, measured work, and evenings spent in subdued contemplation by the dim light of old, patched windows. During their occasional lunch breaks, Jacob and Elizabeth discovered a comfortable cadence in their exchange, often speaking in small fragments about the weather, the condition of the barn, or the transient beauty of a sunrise over the rolling fields. Elizabeth mentioned, in an offhand manner, that she had taken over the farm after her husband passed away, a fact that resonated deeply with Jacob, who every day carried the weight of his own tragic loss. Yet, she did not delve into details, and her responses were always brief, thoughtful, and laced with a quiet dignity. For Jacob, these soft-spoken interactions were more than a polite exchange. They were a lifeline. Living on the road for so long had eroded his sense of belonging, leaving him with the gnawing fear that he had lost his voice in the roar of the city's indifference. Now, here on this small farm, there was a hint of a homecoming, a chance not just to rebuild his material life, but to restore parts of himself long thought lost. He found himself looking forward to the moments when Elizabeth's eyes would soften as she glanced over at his work, acknowledging his efforts in silent admiration. At the close of the day, as shadows stretched long over the ripened fields and the barn's silhouette merged with the coming twilight, Jacob would sit on the back steps of the farmhouse. He'd watch Lily play near a rusted tractor and listen to the distant sounds of cicadas chirping in the cooling air. The world here moved slow, and in that deliberate pace, he felt a stirring of possibilities that he had not dared to imagine before. There was both solace and a whisper of unspoken promise among the rows of tall grass and sturdy oaks. A promise that perhaps, amid the ruins of loss, a new chapter was quietly waiting to begin. Jacob's days at the farm quickly evolved from routine repair work into an unexpected investigation into the mysteries buried at the property. Every creak of the old barn and every whispered conversation with the wind now carried a hint of something larger, something concealed beneath layers of worn wood and faded facades. One bright morning, as Jacob was working on replacing a sagging rafter on the barn roof, a loose plank caught his attention. While assessing the damage, he discovered a small gap behind a battered, dust-covered cabinet in the farmhouse office. Curiosity, fueled by months of living on the edge of hope, urged him to pry the plank aside. Beneath the gap lay a weathered leather envelope that, despite its battered exterior, hinted at the careful preservation of memories. With trembling fingers, Jacob opened the envelope and pulled out a faded photograph. The image was black and white, showing a teenage boy with striking features and eyes that burned with both defiance and sorrow. The uncanny resemblance between the young man in the photograph and Jacob himself was impossible to ignore. A scrawled inscription on the back read simply, "My dear son, forever in my heart." The discovery sent a shiver through Jacob, a mingling of wonder and a mysterious sense of destiny. Not content with just one clue, Jacob began to explore further. In a dusty corner of the farmhouse office, tucked away inside a wooden filing cabinet, he uncovered a ledger with meticulously kept financial records. As he flipped through the fragile pages, he noted figures that were astronomical compared to the outward simplicity of the farm. Documents contained company logos from some of the largest agribusiness conglomerates, and deposit slips listing sums that reached million-dollar figures. These were not the records of a struggling, modest homestead. They painted a portrait of someone who wielded remarkable wealth and influence. The magnitudes of these transactions seemed entirely incongruous with the worn, rural setting in which he now found himself. Jacob's mind raced. How could Elizabeth Shepherd, the quiet, reserved woman who managed her property on her own since her husband's passing, be connected to such vast resources? Each new detail deepened the mystery. The presence of expensive machinery parked behind the old hangars, tractors and harvesters that shone with modern brilliance, bearing logos of well-known agricultural giants, only added to the puzzle. It was as though the modest exterior was a carefully constructed facade, concealing something extraordinary behind the scenes. Unable to contain his mounting curiosity, Jacob resolved to ask Elizabeth about these discoveries. Later that afternoon, while taking a short break from mending a particularly stubborn section of the barn, he approached the farmhouse cautiously. The sky was painted with the mellow hues of late afternoon as he knocked softly on the office door. When the door creaked open, Elizabeth stood there with a quiet, guarded expression. The unmistakable trace of weariness lined her eyes, yet they also shimmered with a secret pain that miraculously resonated with Jacob's own experiences. "Elizabeth," Jacob began hesitantly, holding out the old photograph with careful reverence. "I found this behind the cabinet. May I ask, who is he?" His voice was steady but carried the underlying tremor of vulnerability that came from unearthing memories best left buried. For a long, deliberate moment, Elizabeth's eyes flickered over the photograph. Her face, usually impassive, now betrayed a glimmer of deep sadness and something akin to regret. Without a word, she slowly took the photograph from his hand. The only sound was the quiet rustling of its brittle paper as she inspected it. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "This is my son." Her words seemed to freeze time itself, hanging in the still air like a mournful dirge. After a brief pause that carried the weight of years of unspoken grief, she continued softly, "He's no longer here." The statement fell over Jacob like a crashing wave. A tangled mixture of shock, compassion, and an inexplicable connection welled up inside him. The young man in the photo, bearing an undeniable resemblance to him, suddenly carried a resonance far beyond the obvious. A bittersweet reminder that loss cuts deep and can echo in the most unexpected ways. That night, as Jacob sat on the back steps of the farmhouse with the photograph clutched in his hand, he replayed the brief conversation in his mind. The gentle moonlight illuminated the worn pages of the ledger he had found, and in its somber glow, he found himself piecing together a narrative that was both heart-wrenching and confounding. Elizabeth's quiet life, the carefully maintained property, the hidden signs of wealth, and now the revelation of a lost son. All of it began to form a mosaic of sorrow, resilience, and secret prosperity. Despite the flood of questions surging in his mind, what truly is Elizabeth's story? Why does the boy in the photo resemble me so uncannily? And how can one quiet woman manage such wealth while appearing so modest? Jacob realized that each new clue deepened the enigma. The discrepancies between the outward simplicity of the property and the hidden opulence in the documents were not accidents. They were deliberate choices, carefully crafted to protect secrets too painful to distribute in the open light. In subsequent days, while he labored to restore the weather-beaten barn, Jacob kept a closer eye on his surroundings. He began to notice more subtle hints. A set of keys inexplicably larger than any practical tool hung from a wall in the office. A stack of correspondences detailing transactions with some of the state's largest agricultural entities neatly bound in a folder that Elizabeth seemed to guard fiercely. And the occasional sight of pristine, modern equipment parked in incongruous alignment with the dilapidated appearance of the barn structure. Yet, whenever Jacob inquired further about these curiosities, Elizabeth's responses were measured, almost impenetrable. She would only offer a slight shrug or an apologetic look, quickly diverting the conversation back to immediate tasks. Her silence, woven with a quiet mourning and a protective instinct, only deepened the mystery. It was as if her lips were sealed by a promise, to never unveil the painful truths that the wealth and the secret history of the farm carried. Jacob realized that Elizabeth's reticence was not born solely of humble pride. There was a raw emotional core behind her composure, a story of a love lost, of painful sacrifice, and of a burden too immense to share freely. The photograph of her son, now clasped tightly in his hand, began to materialize in his thoughts as a symbol of that treasured loss. Even though he had known nothing of her past before, he now sensed that this was a woman who had suffered a profound grief, a grief so intense that it had led her to hide away her fortunes and her true self from a world that had perhaps once failed her. As twilight deepened into night and the cicadas chorused in the distance, Jacob resolved to keep his discoveries to himself for a little while longer. He would finish the repairs of the barn as promised and watch, quietly, as the layers of secrets slowly revealed themselves. Amid the worn wood, dusty ledgers, and a lost photograph bearing the mark of sorrow, Jacob felt that his own journey was about to intertwine with hers in ways he could never have predicted. One late afternoon, after a long day of labor under a fading sun, Jacob found himself lingering near the farmhouse's back porch. The gentle hum of cicadas blended with the soft rustle of the wind through overgrown grass, crafting a quiet lull that invited introspection. Jacob's mind was abuzz with the clues he had discovered. The ledger filled with striking numbers, the impeccable modern machinery hidden behind old structures, and the haunting photograph of a young man that so unervingly resembled him. Unable to contain the mixture of curiosity and compassion any longer, he resolved that tonight, after work was done, he would gently ask Elizabeth about the photograph and the secrets it seemed to hold. Later that evening, as twilight draped the land in a tender blue-gray light, Jacob approached the farmhouse slowly. He found Elizabeth seated on the time-worn wooden steps of the porch, gazing out toward the fields. The silence of the dusk was punctuated only by the soft cadence of her breathing and the occasional distant call of night birds. Jacob cleared his throat quietly. "Elizabeth," he began, choosing his words with care. "I've been meaning to ask you about the photograph I found in that old envelope, the one of the young man who looks so much like me." He paused, his voice soft yet steady. "I know you said he was your son. Would you mind telling me more about him?" The question seemed to draw a long, heavy silence over the space between them. For several moments, Elizabeth's eyes remained transfixed on the horizon, as if the fading light stirred memories best left unspoken. Then, with a slow exhale that seemed to carry the weight of decades of sorrow, she turned to Jacob. Her face, usually so guarded, softened into an expression of melancholy vulnerability. "In a way, you remind me of him," Elizabeth said quietly, her tone steady despite the tremor of pain beneath. "My son. He was everything I ever loved." She paused, glancing down at her trembling hands before continuing. He joined the military when I was barely able to comprehend the seriousness of the world. I was young, yet full of hope, and I believed he would do great things. Instead, fate had other plans. Her voice wavered as she recalled the past, and Jacob could see unshed tears shimmering in her eyes. He was sent off to fight in a war that tore the country apart, and I lost him in battle. Jacob's heart tightened involuntarily. He had anticipated hardship, but the rawness of Elizabeth's admission struck him deeply. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, struggling to find words that might offer any comfort to the woman before him. "I can't imagine the pain. Losing a child is something no parent should ever have to endure." Elizabeth's lips quivered as she managed a sad smile, her gaze intermittently shifting between the darkening fields and the softly lit farmhouse. "There is a particular day I will never forget," she whispered. "It was during a firefight. They said it was one of the worst days of the war. My son was so brave. Even in those terrible moments, he showed compassion for his fellow soldiers. I received a letter months later, written in his characteristic clear hand, though it was too late. The war had claimed him entirely. I buried him with nothing but the memory of his courage and the painful realization that I would not have another chance to hear his voice." Her voice grew even softer, almost as if the grief was being cradled in every syllable. "Sometimes, I see a man walking by with a kind of quiet resilience, a look in his eyes that mirrors the hope and determination I remember so well in him. At first, I never understood why those fleeting reminders would sneak up on me. But now I wonder if fate bends in mysterious ways." She paused and hesitated, then said, "I have always dreaded to speak of him, as reviewing the past opens old wounds. But maybe it was inevitable. Meeting someone who reminds me of the child I lost, someone who might share even a sliver of his spirit." Jacob listened intently as he allowed the delicate confession to sink in. It was not only the revelation of a tragic loss, but the embodiment of a lifetime of hidden burdens. "Elizabeth," Jacob said carefully, "I know I'm just an outsider in your story, but I'm beginning to see that we share more than just a place in this world. We share loss and longing. I can't fathom the depth of your sorrow, but I promise you, I respect the memory of your son." His words came out sincere, tinted with an empathy born out of his own recent losses. Her eyes shone with gratitude and still lingering grief, and for a moment, the world around them felt drawn into an intimate cocoon of shared vulnerability. "I've lived in silence since he died," Elizabeth confessed, her voice echoing in the cool evening air. "I tried to build a life here, maintaining this farm and keeping his memory safe, even if it meant living modestly and letting the world believe I was just a simple, grieving widow. I never wanted pity, only to honor his memory without being overwhelmed by it. That's why I kept everything hidden. The wealth, the success. It was all a private fortress built to protect the one memory I couldn't let go." Jacob's gaze drifted to the numerous clues he had uncovered. The expensive machinery, the financial ledgers, the neatly tied documents, and an unsettling realization began to dawn on him. The quiet, humble facade of the farm was not an accident. It appeared to be a deliberate shield to guard against the harsh intrusion of public scrutiny. "So, you concealed all of that?" he asked softly, the tone mingling wonder with a tinge of bewilderment. "Not because you're ashamed of it, but because you wanted to keep the memory of your son alive in a space free of judgment?" Elizabeth's lips curved into a bittersweet smile as she nodded slowly. "Yes, in a world that demands labels and judgment, I chose to live simply. I wanted to be known by who I was and what I lost, not by what I could have become if circumstances were different. My son was taken from me too soon, and I've spent every day since then trying to honor him by living with the integrity he deserved. I never felt it right to flaunt wealth when so many of us are burdened by loss. And perhaps I was also afraid that if I allowed anyone to know the truth, I'd risk being hurt all over again, losing the scarce solace I've found in this quiet existence." The conversation lingered like a delicate dance between pain and hope. For Jacob, the discussion was not just about uncovering a hidden past. It was about understanding how deeply grief could sculpt a person's choices and shroud their gifts in secrecy. In that vulnerable moment, standing on that worn porch under a twilight sky, Jacob's heart grew fuller with compassion. A strange, unspoken bond began to form between him and Elizabeth. Two souls, scarred by loss, finding unexpected resonance in each other's truths. As night fell, and the stars began to punctuate the deep indigo of the sky, Elizabeth's confession left Jacob with both a heavy sadness and a budding determination. Determination to not only complete his work on the barn, but also to support her in keeping her sanctuary intact. A sanctuary born of grief, yet imbued with the quiet dignity of a love lost. In the soft darkness, as they parted ways for the night, an unspoken promise filled the cooling air. That despite the weight of the past, sometimes the truth, when shared with honesty, could forge a path toward healing and maybe even a new beginning. It began on a brisk morning when dark, sleek vehicles rolled onto the gravel drive leading to Elizabeth's farmhouse. Jacob had been finishing up his daily repairs on the barn when he noticed the heavy rumble of engines approaching, a tone that didn't quite match the quiet life of the farmstead. Standing by the weathered barn door, he watched as two black SUVs, their surfaces polished to a reflective sheen, slowly pulled up beside the modest farmhouse. Men and women in tailored suits and pristine shirts, carrying leather briefcases and wearing expressions of quiet authority, descended with an air of deliberate purpose. Jacob's heart pounded with a mix of apprehension and curiosity as he tried to fathom why such well-dressed visitors were here. Just moments later, Elizabeth emerged onto the porch. Her usual measured calm was replaced by a slight tension that made her eyes flicker with concern. With a composed nod, she greeted the visitors in a soft, even tone. "Good morning and welcome. Please, come in." As the visitors assembled in the simple, yet impeccably maintained farmhouse office, a room that now revealed subtle hints of opulence behind its veneer of rustic practicality, they wasted no time introducing themselves as representatives of a major investment firm specializing in agribusiness. One of them, a man with a deep, resonant voice and a polished demeanor, introduced himself as Mr. Reynolds. "Miss Shepherd," he said, "we have been reviewing preliminary documents and records related to your property. There appear to be discrepancies between the modest operation we assumed and the extensive holdings you manage." His eyes moved over a spread of paperwork that Elizabeth had provided earlier, the documents which Jacob had once glimpsed in secrecy. As Mr. Reynolds spoke, the murmurs of the assembled group grew louder, punctuated by nods of agreement at particular figures, numbers that were substantial beyond any conventional farm in such a small town. Jacob, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, felt his stomach clench as he heard numbers he never imagined. 4,800 acres. Someone mentioned, and another investor leaned in to confirm, and a valuation that rivals some of the top agrarian enterprises in the state. The sheer scale of it struck him like a bolt of lightning. This was no mere repair job for a modest, run-down barn. It was part of an intricate financial and agricultural puzzle that far exceeded the humble image Elizabeth had carefully curated. Inside the office, Elizabeth maintained her professional composure. "I run my affairs with discretion," she replied calmly when pressed for details. "My late husband and I built this legacy together, managing a far larger estate than meets the eye. It has been our way of protecting our family's interests and ensuring that what we've built remains intact." Yet, even as she spoke, there was a tremor in her voice, a fragile vulnerability that hinted at burdens borne alone over many years. Jacob felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. All the weeks he'd spent working under the impression of a struggling farm, all the quiet conversations in hushed tones with Elizabeth on the porch, were now framed by an entirely different reality. In his heart, a sense of betrayal churned. He had accepted the job under the honest promise of a simple repair project, a contract that he believed would help him get back on his feet. Now, learning of the immense wealth behind the operation, Jacob felt deceived. Had he been misled about his employer's situation? Was he just another expendable worker in a game so much larger than he ever imagined? Outside, as the investors' meeting pressed on, hushed conversations spilled into the open. Jacob approached Elizabeth as she stepped out to take a brief break from the formalities. His voice, usually steady from years of hard labor and quiet determination, trembled with a mix of anger and hurt. "Ms. Shepherd," he asked quietly, "why didn't you tell me about what this place really is? That you own all this land? I was told I'd be fixing an old barn, not working for a multimillion-dollar operation." Elizabeth's eyes softened with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "Jacob," she said almost whisperingly, "I never wanted to deceive you. I made a promise to myself long ago to live my life quietly, to protect the memory of the man I lost, and to shield my work from the corruption of greed and exploitation. I chose a life where fewer eyes could pry into my business. I wanted this to remain a sanctuary, far from the aggressive world of corporate investment." The confession, though heartfelt, did little to dissipate the storm within Jacob. He felt an acute sense of disillusionment. The ideal of a simple, honest job had been shattered by the realization that sometimes the world conceals its true nature behind layers of modest appearances. His eyes repeatedly returned to the documents he'd seen in the farmhouse office, the ledgers, the transaction slips, the hints of deals made with industry giants. Everything painted a picture of wealth and influence far beyond his own modest struggles. As the meeting wore on, the investors continued to sift through Elizabeth's records, discussing future plans and potential partnerships. The weight of each number and each signature was a stark reminder that the world of agriculture was not always what it seemed on the surface. Elizabeth, ever dignified, defended her choices, explaining that her strategy was to preserve her family's legacy without inviting unwanted attention. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay the quiet agony of a woman who had sacrificed her truth to protect what remained of her heart. Jacob, meanwhile, retreated to a corner of the barn, his fists clenched as he grappled with conflicting feelings. A sense of betrayal mixed with empathy, weighing his own recent experiences of loss and hardship against the backdrop of this newfound reality. He had expected a temporary job, a lifeline in his time of need. Instead, he had become an unwilling witness to a hidden world of wealth and sorrow. As the investors eventually departed, leaving behind a silence heavy with unasked questions, Jacob resolved to confront these revelations head-on. The path forward was murky, and though he felt deceived, he also understood that Elizabeth's secrecy was not born of malice but of a deeply personal need to protect an aching past. He knew that in order to move on, and perhaps to find a sense of purpose in this tangled mosaic of loss, love, and undisclosed wealth, he needed to understand her story completely, even if it meant unearthing truths that might challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the life he aspired to rebuild. In the quiet solitude of a chilly early morning, after the investors had departed and the echoes of that turbulent day still rang in his ears, Jacob found himself once again standing at the edge of the farmhouse porch. The events of the previous day, the revelation of hidden wealth, the bittersweet confession about Elizabeth's lost son, and the sting of betrayal mixed with empathy, had left him wrestling with a tumult of emotions. Determined to learn more and to make sense of the surprises he'd uncovered, he resolved that today he must speak with Elizabeth again, not as a worker demanding answers, but as someone whose own heart had been battered by loss and was slowly learning to trust again. As the first light of dawn softened the horizon, Jacob stepped inside the modest foyer of the farmhouse. The air smelled faintly of old wood and fresh earth, a gentle reminder that even in simplicity, life could nurture hope. He found Elizabeth in the kitchen, standing by a window where the early rays made delicate patterns on the worn wooden table. For a long moment, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken memories and the weight of shared solitude. "Elizabeth," Jacob began softly, leaning against the counter in a gesture that bridged the space between caution and intimacy. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday, about your son, and about everything hidden behind these walls." He paused, searching for the right words. "I understand you chose to conceal so much of your life, and I can see now that it was not meant to deceive but to protect a memory, a pain that never quite left you." Elizabeth's eyes dropped for an instant, and then, like shy rays of sunlight peeking through storm clouds, they shimmered with sorrow and guarded honesty. Her voice, when it came, was soft and laden with decades of resilience bruised by loss. "I haven't trusted people since the day I lost him," she murmured, her tone both lamenting and resolute. That day, when I received the news, something in me shattered. I vowed that nobody, not even those I was close to, could ever breach the fortress of my grief. Everything I built afterward, the quiet farm, the simplicity of my routines, even the careful concealment of our true prosperity, it was all my way of keeping the past at bay. It was a way of saying, I will protect my memories, and I will not let the world exploit my pain for its gain. Jacob listened intently, his heart aching with empathy. In his own battles with loss, his wife gone suddenly, his old life reduced to memories and a battered car, he understood that the heart sometimes shuts itself off from people as a means of survival. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know what it's like to be hurt so deeply that trusting anyone seems impossible. I never meant to intrude on your pain or make you feel like you had to hide who you are. A tear glistened as Elizabeth slowly regarded him, as if measuring his sincerity against the fortress of her past. Sometimes, she admitted, the burden is so heavy that you build walls around your soul. I lost my only child in a war, the kind of loss that leaves you feeling abandoned by fate itself. I was alone then, and I promised myself I would never need to reach out again. The wealth, the extensive records, the pristine machines, they are all part of what my husband and I built long ago. They were meant to secure our future, but after he died, I realized that no amount of money or property could fill the void left by his absence. I retreated into silence because opening up meant risking that pain all over again. The raw truth in her confession stirred something within Jacob. I once believed that taking a job was just about earning a paycheck, he admitted, his voice trembling with both reflection and a flicker of newfound understanding. But here, with you, I'm learning that sometimes a simple job can lead to a discovery of shared grief, and maybe even a chance to heal. I felt deceived when I learned of your wealth, not out of greed, but because I had trusted the story of a humble, struggling legacy. I see now how failure to share the truth was your way of protecting yourself from further harm. Elizabeth's expression softened, and the stern lines etched by years of hidden sorrow seemed to yield to something gentler. A cautious hope that perhaps someone could understand her in a way that others never had. It isn't easy, she confessed, to let someone in after so long of guarding your heart. After losing my son, I vowed never to be vulnerable. Trust became a luxury I simply could not afford. And yet, as I watch you work so diligently and see the passion in your eyes when you speak of rebuilding your life, I wonder, maybe there's still room to believe in second chances. Perhaps I can allow myself, even if just a little, to trust that not everyone is out to hurt you or exploit your pain. Jacob reached out and gently placed his calloused hand over hers, a silent reassurance that the scars of the past did not have to dictate the future. Sometimes the past leaves us believing that loss is the end of something beautiful in our lives, he murmured. But maybe, just maybe, it can be the beginning of something new. I'm here, working hard and trying to rebuild my life, and your story moves me. It makes me believe that even the shattered pieces of our past can be pieced together into something stronger. The silence that followed was filled with a tender understanding, a soft communion between two souls who had both been hardened by life's relentless blows, yet still dared to dream of renewal. Elizabeth squeezed his hand gently. I haven't shared this part of me with anyone in a very long time, she confessed. Not since I lost my son. It hurts every time I remember him. But maybe talking about it can relieve some of the loneliness that has haunted me. I don't trust easily. People have come and gone, offering hollow sympathy. But your genuine care, the way you see beyond the surface, gives me a glimmer of hope that I can start to open up again. Outside, the morning gave way to a clear, bright day. The cool air carried away remnants of the night's shadow, and as the farmhouse came alive with the sound of gentle conversation, the beginnings of reconciliation unfolded slowly between them. Jacob knew that the road ahead would be complicated, that healing wounds as deep as the ones they carried would take time and patience. Yet, in Elizabeth's soft, steady words and in the quiet cadence of their shared confessions, there lay the fragile promise of a new chapter, one where trust was not given lightly, but earned through the honest telling of our most painful truths. In that quiet moment of vulnerability, the two found themselves not only moving toward practical understanding but, more importantly, toward emotional healing. A testament that even in the aftermath of loss, the heart can dare to believe in second chances. As summer's gentle warmth took hold of the countryside, the once lonely farmhouse and its sprawling fields began to transform into a sanctuary of newfound hope. In the aftermath of revelations, painful confessions, and hard-won understandings, Jacob Hunt no longer saw his work simply as a temporary job. It had evolved into a doorway to rebuilding his life. With each repaired board on the barn and every mended step on the farm's weathered porch, he found himself not only restoring aging wood, but also reclaiming pieces of a shattered identity. Over the course of several weeks, Elizabeth Shepherd and Jacob forged an unspoken, yet ever-deepening bond. In the early light of dawn, they would stand side by side working on new projects. A fresh coat of paint here, a reinforced beam there. Their hands busy, their thoughts converging into a shared purpose. Elizabeth, who had long guarded her heart behind a facade of quiet solitude, began to let small fragments of warmth and trust seep through. As she explained her choices, the careful concealment of wealth to protect memories, the pain of losing her only son, and the silent vow to preserve what his loss had taught her. Jacob listened with understanding born of his own recent grief. Each word from her lips wove their lives together like threads in a tapestry of healing, built on the acknowledgement of past sorrows and the promise of new beginnings. One late afternoon, as the golden sun dipped low over the ripening fields, Jacob and Elizabeth sat together on the back porch of the farmhouse. The gentle murmur of the wind across the quiet landscape was punctuated by the soft laughter of Lily, who had come out to play. She tumbled out from behind a weathered wagon and approached Elizabeth with gleeful abandon. "Grandma, come play with me," she called, her bright eyes full of innocent affection. In that single moment, the world shifted for both Jacob and Elizabeth. For Jacob, it was a revelation that he was no longer adrift in his struggles. For Elizabeth, it was the gentle confirmation that she could extend her nurturing love once more, even if it was not in the form she had always known. Elizabeth's face softened as she bent down to envelop Lily in an embrace tinged with both tenderness and a quiet, lingering sorrow. "Of course, dear," she whispered, and in that word, the seeds of a new family were planted in the fertile ground of shared loss and hope. Jacob watched them with a heart swelling with gratitude and amazement. He recalled the days when life had seemed only a series of closed doors and endless hardship. Now, in the warm, fading light of day, every setback and every tear had somehow led him to this very moment. A moment where second chances were not mere fantasies, but a hard-earned reality. In the weeks that followed, the once-forgotten farm began to flourish as a center of renewal. Together, Jacob and Elizabeth began to plan not only further repairs to the old barn but also small improvements around the property, investments in both the land and in their collective future. They discussed the possibility of opening a community workshop where local residents could learn valuable repair skills, and even considered establishing a modest bed and breakfast to share the rejuvenated charm of the farmhouse with visitors. The prospects of such ventures lit a fire in Jacob's chest, an inner spark that whispered of a future rebuilt with love, purpose, and resilience. As the days unfolded into a gentle rhythm of honest work and mutual support, the bonds formed between them grew unmistakably strong. Jacob, who had once been defined solely by loss and struggle, began to see himself as part of something greater, a budding partnership in which both he and Elizabeth were healing. And in the playful, trusting eyes of little Lily, who now affectionately called Elizabeth Grandma, he witnessed the emergence of a surrogate family, one born not of blood, but of the shared journey towards redemption and hope. He looked for temporary work, and found a second chance, and she lost her son, to feel like she can still be a mom. Subscribe if you believe that fate sometimes gives us exactly what we have already lost.